Partners, an executive search and leadership advisory firm. I'm also the co-founder of The Council, a private network for senior executives. And this is Leaders in Motion. My guest today, Anine Hansen, started at Ralph Lauren, moved to Chanel, and as Executive Retail Director for Europe, then Managing Director at Armani, then Global Managing Director at Roger Vivier. In 2009, she founded LAH Advisory and has spent the years since then advising the C-suites and brands she used to run. Anine, welcome to Leaders in Motion.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
Anine, so like we do with all our guests, we usually ask them to introduce themselves mainly from a career perspective. So you have professionally sort of two lives, one in the corporate world and now with your advisory. Maybe you can tell me more about that and introduce yourself.
Absolutely, for sure. I probably always round up my, let's say, operational career before moving into advisory through 3 steps. Since I started out my career in the luxury sector, where I spent 5 years with Valentino in a combined retail and buying position before moving into Ralph Lauren and later on into general management before Giorgio Armani, Chanel, and then Giorgio Armani. And the last position in corporate was global managing director for Roger Vivier, the French luxury brand. So that's pretty much the larger span of my trajectory in corporate. And that is what led me to move into the other side of strategy consulting. So into an advisory position. And I suspect, if that was the question, I suspect that we are different at ALH Advisory because essentially we combine aspects of setting a strategic vision combined with creative branding to present implementable and actionable roadmaps for our clients.
Maybe you can tell me more about how this operating experience helped you in your advisory today.
My operational career helps a lot when you are on the when you're on the advisory side in strategy consulting, because your advice becomes realistic and pragmatic. I put myself in the shoes of anyone who is responsible for delivering results, and essentially a P&L. Sometimes I sort of cruelly say that I'm not necessarily keen to provide strategic advice unless it is something that can turn into tangible results, right? I think what drove me from being, call it an insider to an advisor, is my passion of creating strong brands, elevating positions and value creation. You probably have a strong brand if it looks and feels as a strong brand, and if your craftsmanship and your manufacturing capabilities reflect those values. When you work for large corporates, it's in a way what I call real life universities, because you may acquire a lot of academic knowledge when you go through your education process. So it's about, again, delivering impact and results. That is definitely most of the aspects that our clients are looking for. Also, some clients, big clients that belong to, let's say, groups or independent brands, they're struggling with another aspect, Kevin, often of knowing who their clients are. Because you can only build efficient engagement processes through, let's say, how you interact with your end consumer and how your product assortment and your pricing structure is once you actually know your clients, right? So data management becomes the knowledge base for a lot of clients when it comes to core clientele or client compositions. So I would say that's a big ask these days.
You mentioned about tangible impacts. And do you feel that today, because you might have seen that evolution today, that companies are really looking into an immediate results when especially comes to consulting services now, and this is something that they care more than they used to? And if so, how do you deliver upon that demand and expectation?
I mean, it's definitely something we observed the whole time. As I started out by saying, I mean, our clients are largely speaking interested in 2 things: creating a long-term vision, the long lens, and future-proofing your operations, your activities, whilst ensuring that there is a short lens and delivery process that is focused on tangible deliveries, ROIs, and performance, how you boost performance. It can be regionally, it can be in certain product categories. So we'll try and fine tune every time we provide advice and actions according to specific client needs. In other words, we never or rarely ever will sell off-the-shelf advice. We would be very specific and bespoke, and we will probably spend a long time immersing ourselves into why. I'm just taking the example of a certain product category not necessarily performing. Or it can be areas of why, for example, a retail staff is not able to upsell and cross-sell. Oftentimes that is related to training and how much a given brand actually expend to empower their sales associates, because they are essentially advisors. So depending on the case, there is not one answer that fits all, because we work in a very bespoke manner. But how do we ensure that brands are achieving the ROIs that they're expecting? We work very closely with them, and we do a lot in terms of workshops. We animate with the teams that will be responsible for example, retail teams, marketing teams, in order for the entire process to be agile in terms of delivery. Because oftentimes what we still today see, irrespective of innovation and tech and AI, we see, sadly, how siloed companies still are. And it's breaking down the barriers to a certain extent that sometimes we feel that we are doing in terms of working across the board, across divisions, in order to deliver results. Because you will need a marketing strategy. You'll need to understand how they boost systems, how they boost sales, and how actual, retail teams are using those, and how they're used in an omni-channel perspective, because the digital and physical are becoming one of the same aspects in terms of deliveries. There are so many cases I could think of, because, are we talking beauty? Are we talking fine jewelry? Are we talking fashion? People come, as I said earlier, to us with very different cases. One case could be, a fashion brand. I prefer to stay neutral for the respect of our clients. A fashion brand that was going global, that was American, that still is. They did not necessarily have the right understanding in terms of different regions on how you go global, right? So you can't use the same go-to-market strategy for coming from the US into Europe as you can for Asia. I could add into the equation as well for the Middle East. But let's just take the example, which was the first ask, was to develop, a very specific growth strategy to how to expand into Europe and into the Middle East. We look always, Kevin, at the semiotic aspects, which is something that is extremely important, because those are the mirror or the reflection of different cultures, symbols and signs. Then we would do a sound market analysis of how, customer preferences look, market and dynamics, company capabilities, competition, collaborators, and so on, to get a sort of market reality check. If there are companies that have male or female product, and in the case of the American brand, there was only female products, but there was a lot of product merchandising to take into a place. And there was a lot of, let's say, probably target shift in terms of customer profiling. So how do you reach a new local customer base, and are your strategies resonating? And then we kind of, after that, look at the marketing mix, kind of what are we selling? Where are we selling? Depending on the channel mix and the distribution. And then we would go very strongly into the last aspect of clienteling and customer acquisition or customer recruiting, to again reflect the cultural curation aspect and build awareness, execute the image and branding side of things. And that will in turn, kind of come up with a set of engagement processes of how you win over new clients. But really what value creating and growth strategy are based on is 3 stages, right? One is reach, your key customer acquisition drivers, and then convert, performance through conversion, and then how to retain, because that's really where you enter the equation of customer lifetime value drivers. So in the case of this American brand, we set up that whole ramification, but we also had to look at pricing because some of their product categories were not, let's say, positioned in a way that they would gain performance in Europe or in Asia. So there are many things that we had to fine tune with them in order to enter the last aspect of the customer lifetime creation aspect, right? Because that's really where everyone is looking to today, let's say, is how you create customer lifetime value drivers. But another big question is, how do you retain your clients? That's another recurrent question we get from our clients, because a client globally today is probably less brand loyal compared to, say, 15 years ago. If you were a hardcore Chanel client, a hardcore Dior client, you may stay with the given brand. Whereas today, both the younger demographics and the Gen X's and what have you, they are by and large less brand loyal. So I don't know if that answers your question. So it varies a lot, I would say, your investment, your actual investment as to external strategy advisors, the real metrics and the real metrics of measuring success is more a case of, okay, what are we not doing today and how well could we do? I think that's probably the biggest question that most brands ask themselves. So it's kind of how you come up with adequate and result-based roadmaps that will lead to an ROI increase, right? So if you are saying whatever in travel retail, for example, if you have a strong business, but you could do a lot better, well, then your ROIs will be measured by region typically. So it's very different. The channels are also very a part of the big variables because you've got department stores in case of beauty that are a large revenue stream. You've got travel retail. In some cases, you've got, own retail. So they aren't comparable. So there are different metrics to each of the channels.
That's, I could not have asked for a better, more complete answer. However, allow me to rewind a little bit back. And if you could also introduce yourself more on a more personal level. I mean, you have quite a very unique journey. You have worked in France. You're Denmark, and you speak different languages, and you work with different cultures and countries. So it is quite unique and interesting. Maybe you can guide us through this interesting journey.
Of course. I mean, yes, I'm Danish, no denying it. And I have studied in the UK, but prior to that, when I was younger, I actually went to France where I did something about improving my French. So that's about now 40 years ago. And that sort of led me back into France after completing my master's degree in communications and marketing in London, right back to France, where I almost by chance, after a brief career in contemporary art in London, moved into the fashion industry where my first job was at Valentino. So yes, you're right, maybe pointing out that I am not French, although I've lived in France most of my life. But oddly enough, I've always worked globally. So I'm one of these people, when you come from a small country, I suspect that you learn a bunch of languages to begin with. So, they are somewhat obsolete in the sense that they're all European. My dream would have been to speak Chinese, Japanese, and other languages that are not European. But hey, you get far by speaking English. But again, languages, Kevin, you're right, perhaps insisting on that notion, because languages do open doors. Because I've always found that being a foreigner in whichever country I've lived in, you become more adaptable and you become a natural listener and a natural, call it flexible and agile person, because you need to adapt into something that you've not perhaps been raised in. And I think that's one of the things that have always stayed with me. Also perhaps my natural curiosity. Some people call it generosity as well, because probably I'm quite I'm a natural networker is what people tell me. But again, that is almost the extension of being able to, let's say, be able to read the room, as I call it, because you pick up differences. And sometimes when people are nonverbal, they can actually convey a lot. When you are in negotiations in Japan, in China, in the Middle East, sometimes the non-verbal communication can be as impactful as the verbal communication has. But I've also worked for different types of employers, ranging from Americans, Italian, a lot of Italians, French. So that also, again, gives you perhaps the obligation having to adapt into different cultures, but all those global brands have a global audience. So you need to adapt being part of a delivery team to where the preferences, cultural customs, and at ALH Advisory, my advisory practice, we look an awful lot on the semiotics, which to a certain extent catches the cultural vibe of any business, because any business will have an NDA, which is, part of their visual language, so to speak. And that can also convey powerful things to different cultures. So I think, we at ALH Advisory, we are all about delivering impactful solutions for our clients. And that naturally means being one step ahead in a sort of mode of being one step ahead in terms of information, because again, I come from an operational background. So I always guide my clients to obtain results that are tangible and actionable, because a lot of what we do today is in a cross-border perspective, is very related to performance, increasing profitability in some cases, ROIs, but we tend to take the creative branding aspect, on board as early in the process as possible, because we find that delivers a more agile, solution-based roadmap.
Well, I could listen to you for a long time without interrupting when it comes, especially to cross-border and culture differences. I like when you say that also the non-verbal is a message in itself, which we call like the silence is a form of communication too. And I'd be curious now to also like deep dive a little bit more about on the topic of cross-cultural or cross-border business and strategy, what you led when you were working in-house and in terms of brands. What were the ambitions and the challenges that you face when it comes to cross-border expansion, when it comes to, I don't know, it could be working with local teams or influencing or bringing your peers in the headquarters to go with your ambitions and deliver results. Or now, more on the advisory side, how do you actually influence, educate, bring your clients to success in different markets? What were the challenges then? What are the challenges now? And I'm sure it's also related to where the trends in the global markets has evolved along the way as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, for sure, the market has changed drastically from I was in-house to today. But oddly enough, I find that when you advise from the outside, based on a solid operational knowledge, you actually come up quite well armed. So I would say, to answer your question about cross-border in luxury, let's say specific to luxury, I mean, the complexity is omnipresent. I think we've seen it over the past couple of years where certain brands have had, let's say, let's be upfront and call it outrageous behavior in certain cultures. And it does alienate a lot of people because they don't feel listened to. And that goes back to the whole perspective of how, probably today, and it's not new, but it is not something that was taken into account maybe 20 years ago. But I still see certain brands employing, let's say, old-fashioned brand management models and business conduct, where they are broadcasting, they are monologuing, they are not dialoguing with the end consumers. So the engagement process is becoming more disruptive because you need to catch people at a known, call it comfort zone, something that is familiar to their culture. And that's why, again, I go back to the semiotic elements of symbols and signs. Color codes as well can be offensive in certain cultures. So, you need to know how to adapt before you have, an effectful and actionable go-to-market strategy. But again, I come from the point of view of listening, taking on board, registering. It's a little bit what I consider intuitive professionalism. And life has taught us to listen to also the nonverbal aspect. I'm not sure if I completely answer your question, but it is also a question of being surrounded by local specificities when it comes to market knowledge, people that speak languages. We're always very respectful. So to summarize, I would probably say listen, agility, and respectfulness in conduct.
Right. And I now, having talked to various leaders in big luxury brands, that what you describe are a bit less apparent today. Maybe that has evolved, and people are more educated about these things. And do you see a difference between the big luxury brands versus the more boutique ones, niche and smaller in scale? Do you see differences?
Yes, we do. I mean, to be truthful, we probably work more typically with the established houses and to some scale ups versus, let's say, startups. But emerging brands and niche brands, they very often do not have global staff to begin with. So they have potentially a harder time adapting into local cultures and, let's say, the fluency of the cultural values. But I also see some of the groups that we have worked with being excessively, what would be the correct word, being excessively European, if they're European, in their mindset. In other words, they have not really yet, for some businesses' part, been able to attract the right guides to lead their businesses in, let's say, the Middle East, across the Pan-Asian continent, or even in the States, because, without being specific, I mean, certain languages, for example, French or Italian, not everyone in America or in Asia or in the Middle East will understand the subliminal aspects. And sometimes companies hire people that they're comfortable with, but that the markets may not necessarily take.
That's touching a very interesting question that I ask myself when it comes to luxury. How do you, when you work for luxury as a leader, you're selling what I call a cultural pride, and in some ways, in many ways, and that is really rooted in your own identity, and rightfully so. But how do you make it resonate to another culture? How do you make it more global, and how do you don't come across as arrogant in terms of your culture?
Yes. I mean, that's precisely what I was probably referring to without using the term arrogant.
Well, you put some really concrete challenges, and down in the end, it comes down to the people, right? It comes down to the leaders,
Yes.
the executives in the company having this rigid mindset of understanding of different cultures and so, have you perceived any situations where leaders, executives, or even the board were either facilitating success when it comes to cross-border expansion and business success, or on the other side, coming across situation where leaders were really not, like, to the point, not really able to grasp, to be agile, to be open, to be curious and humble? And what would you recommend when it comes to what would be the ideal type of leaders that could facilitate that?
Okay. So that's two questions in one almost, because I mean, one is about the governance of a given company and the other is on the board composition. But in a way, they go hand in hand, right? Because, leadership teams are hired by a board typically or by investors. So it starts with the board. So if you have what I call 15 cut from the same cloth type personalities, well, then you get a one channel business vision that most likely will not be able to challenge each other. I think at board level, that ideally should be the ability to challenge each other. But at the same time, you also have to have some sort of harmony between the talent that you have at board level, because otherwise you are unlikely to reach consensus, right? It's like partnerships. I mean, consensus is a big part of what you do when you work in a partnership. And in a way, a board composition is a mini partnership because you have to deliver results. And you also have to be able to make the tough decisions sometimes in terms of, are we, is not a single person question, but are we as a board able to support the business that we have either acquired, or if in case of a listed company, have we put in place the right team, the right skill set, the right technicalities, the right cultural fit, or are we not really going in the right direction? Because sometimes what you can see is that a board composition would recruit people that in the image of themselves. So again, if you have a board that can vary in size, I think experience is another thing that is a big thing, because I mean, those of us that have been around the block a few times, we probably will not go into a panic mode when it comes to, different crises, because you've set a plan and you know that you have to be agile and open to change that plan if it doesn't work. In some cases, immediately, if it's a real crisis, talking about the pandemic, financial crisis, the sort of sadly geopolitical tension that we live in right now. I mean, you have to be able to navigate. So that's the other thing. Stewardship, navigation, and agile, let's say, personalities, to me, is what is needed both at board level and in leadership positions, versus sometimes recruiting individuals that are cut from the same cloth as the board, let's say. But again, at board level, you can probably not have an AI whiz kid of 30 years old if the rest of the team are, I'm saying whatever here as a means of example, ex top lawyers or financial profiles, because then you will not probably have a sinking situation where you would be able to produce consensual, usable advice. Because what a board is more and more asked today is questioning the capabilities of delivering a plan to their investors, or if it's a stock listed company, or if it's a, independent brand. You always ask to someone.
Yes, and that's true. When it comes to board composition, and in luxury industry, well, Asia is not number two behind the US, but China in particular is a big market, right? And
Totally.
however, do you see like in board composition like a quite of a high proportion of Chinese background board members that could advise on that, or even not going that far, even with deep China experience in the boards, or if you don't, maybe can you explain maybe why?
Okay. Well, I see a bit of both. I mean, I do see companies and groups that have a glaring lack of maybe specifically with Chinese individuals that know the industry globally, but others have been smart early on and hired strong Chinese profiles. But do they come from the right industry? Not always. They may hire somebody who comes from gas and oil into a luxury brand just because they have had a certain trajectory. I'm probably exaggerating slightly here, but they may not come with a sector-specific profile. They can come from another sector. And I think there are two things. There are sector-specific capabilities and experience and expertise. And there is the cultural capability, a geographical focus that are probably the two most important aspects. So I think some groups, some businesses are poor in their board composition, and others have been fast in selecting a good and varied type of board members that can actually bring questions, challenge, and support to a leadership team.
I come from the assumption that it is de facto important given the size of the market. However, does it actually matter to have this diversity in the board, especially when it comes to China, when it comes to Asia, or maybe it's you can actually bring that knowledge from the leadership team and not necessarily on a board level?
Well, if you're, that's going to be obviously my personal opinion, but I personally think that an ideal board should have more Asian representation, because those are different markets and they require different capabilities. But I would also say the reverse. because you're seeing now the emergence of, let's say, Chinese brands from across the brand spectrum, from Urban Revival to Anta to Songmont to, you have a ton of different brands that are naming Chinese. You also have obviously Japanese and Korean brands. So I suspect that we'll be seeing a lot coming the reverse way, as in, brands coming out of the Asian continent that needs to adapt the way the European brands have adapted into Asia, into Europe, into the Middle East, and into America. And, some brands, for example, Icicle, they have done a good job, in my opinion, to adapt into a more internationalized, let's say, reality. But we all know that the bulk of their business is still realized on the Chinese continent and to a certain extent in Hong Kong. But I mean, I think we'll be seeing more of that, but they have in a way been ahead of the curve, which is one of the reasons I suspect that Kering has been keen to take a minority position in the Icicle group in order to have a cross-border exchange platform. So that's a smart move, I think. Both on behalf of Icicle having done early what they've done, because they've created visibility at a global scale, but also obviously traction and volume. And now with Kering as a minority partner, they have an opportunity of perhaps going faster in the global market, but equally, accelerate their growth in mainland China. So again, from the board perspective, I mean, I also think that we need different generations. There is an element of demographics because, you have certain, I mean, let's be brutally honest, you have certain elderly board members that think that you have to have had 30 or 40 years experience before you sit on a board. But guess what? The world has changed. And I think you need to have a balanced mix, as I mentioned earlier. But the main aspect is being specific, hold specific capabilities, skill sets, and experience and expertise, because that's when you can challenge each other.
Yeah, and I do agree. It makes me think of also when it comes to the male selling female hygiene products, and then how can you actually make any sense of that situation? It doesn't seem logical.
Yes.
And I like when you mentioned about Icicle, and I like when you mentioned, because in the end of the day, we mentioned a lot about European brands going to Asia, how to be relevant, how to have like the right mindset and agility. But now I think the situation is actually, if we compare, the European brands are doing fantastic job in being global. If you take comparison to the Chinese brands, and to my point, what do you think is currently missing from, and how do you explain the lack of aura that the Chinese brands have? How can it be changed? And how do you think it can be done also from a leadership perspective?
Yeah. I mean, probably it would start by having an open mind, by being receptive to, let's say, include perhaps non-Chinese members, right? Because it is true that China has been building premium brands for a while. Have they reached that potential? I mentioned earlier how certain brands probably have an appeal and a potentiality in terms of reach and maturity that they can get to. And I personally think that you are unlikely to achieve that. A brand is unlikely to achieve its potential unless it's got a mix of, let's say, newcomers, as in perhaps non-Chinese members, because they will be, effectively the best cultural translators and can probably help build growth and scale the brand, because a lot of that is also merchandising. If you're talking fashion, like I've seen a lot of American brands going into Asia, for instance, without paying attention to aspects in a detailed way of the merchandising aspect, different sizing, different vestibility, as you call it in French and Italian. I mean, the offer as well, the product offer needs to be geared and tiered to a given market. And again, we have an aspect of pricing. I think sharp pricing is where we see now with challenger luxury brands, they're getting it right. Whereas a lot of the established brands, we saw that in the post-pandemic phase, they probably went on the journey of massive price hikes to the extent that they lost a lot of their aspirational customers because they couldn't play in that field anymore. Now some are going back and reviewing their price strategies. But what I'm trying to get to is the fact that, new luxury brands, modern luxury brands that are now in the challenger category, they're actually getting the mix right. So I think that's an interesting one as well. But again, Chinese, your question was about Chinese brands going global. It's a question of putting a strong board together, recruiting for the right profiles. But you know better than anyone how difficult it is to recruit, because what I find very often is somebody is perfect on paper and they may be fantastic at Prada and perhaps not very good at one of the LVMH brands, because brands and groups come with different personalities and different kind of atmospheres and corporate cultures, right? So you could add into the equation the fact of hiring people that are not from a given culture, then it amplifies the complexity sometimes, right? I mean, some people say, I don't want to work for a brand of X origin because I can't work with X origins owners or board or whatever. And that's the other thing, because if you want to reach the profiles that can help you execute a plan, they have to be willing to make a change as well.
I like that point. So it's not every company culture. It's not necessarily about the profile you get, but also about the right culture you have in your team that can attract and make the talent thrive within your organization and your team. So that's a great point. I'd like to do a little bit of a shift and getting into a little bit your personal experience when it comes to not necessarily advising boards, but sitting on boards. How is that experience? How does it feel to be on the other side? And maybe you can tell me more about what you do on that regard.
Sitting on boards, you mean? I've been part of certain board advisors from fashion houses, or let's say emerging brands. And, there are days where obviously, depending on the maturity of a brand, you also feel that you are maybe being pulled in to almost guide at an operational level, or you're not there as a replacement for the leadership, right? So I think I'm careful of how I word this, because there is a big shift when brands and businesses are of a certain level, because that's really where they invest as well, in attracting the right profiles. But sometimes we also have to be mindful. I'm saying we as strategy consultants, because that can be conflict of interest as well. So, I'm having some conversations, and of course I can be part of certain types of boards, but then I would have to decline working in the field that the board of the business is present in, right? But, what I'm seeing globally now is that, a lot of the board members that we get contacted by, sometimes they also exist in the case of private equity-backed firms. You basically have a board that is composed of the investors. Does that bring differentiated point of views and capabilities to the table? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes totally yes. Other times, possibly less so.
I like that transition to the private equity, and especially I think I observe from being in Hong Kong, a lot of international brands, Western brand, European brand being acquired by Chinese private Hong Kong private equity firms, and leads towards that. And maybe you can tell us more about how you see the specificities of this fashion house being operated by private equity, and then specifically from private equity that do not necessarily understand the culture of the target market or the origin markets. I'm thinking of Hong Kong private equity acquiring Swedish fashion house or French, etc. Maybe you can tell us more.
Yeah. I mean, there are some of the sort of, top of mind examples when it comes to Chinese owned. I mean, they're stock listed in the US is obviously the Lanvin group that has Lanvin and Sergio Rossi and whatever it's called, the American knitwear brand, and Wolford. So that's a group that I think has got a lot of potential. They now have just announced a new CEO. So we will see how it goes. But I think there has probably been expectations from the Chinese ownership that have not been realistic in a European context. That's how I would probably describe that. You also have other groups like Anta. They have acquired quite a few brands, Jack Wolfskin and others. But I think they've been smart in how they have hired, let's say, people in the geographies to keep the brand intact, the brand spirit intact. And there is a lot to be said about that as well, because you need to keep the halo of a given brand in its pristine format, right? But back to your question on groups and private equity, overall, this is an overall, not necessarily specific to Hong Kong-based private equity firms, but I would say private equity owned companies are by and large quite interesting to work for, both, I believe, for leadership teams, because you get a broader exposure to all the, let's say, various components of a business that constitute a business, but also for people like us coming in with, with a mindset of looking at the long lens, how you future-proof your business in terms of operational know-how, IT, system, supply chain, all these kind of things. But again, we merge branding with strategy consulting. So for us, we can be very effectful for these type of firms, because we know that if a brand is private equity owned, they typically have milestones that they need to reach within a given time frame, because the intention is not to own a brand for life. The intention is typically to own it for a specific period of time. And so value creation and let's say enhancing performance and systems are paramount during that period. So it caters to a fast-paced, accelerated speed, because you need to look at many aspects at the same time. What I find is that, today's businesses in luxury, we also work in design, hospitality, beauty, but most of the time, a brand sets a long-term vision with a parallel track that is short-term execution. I mean, before we even sit down with people, initial calls are very often focused on, okay, what have you delivered over the period of the past 6 months? How has it affected the business? I mean, literally like that. And, I like that, because it is where we want to be. We want to be where we can make real change, not selling strategy advice or creative branding solutions that will not reach, let's say, its audience. We want it to translate into impactful roadmaps that will produce results, right? So that is sometimes what we see with private equity owned brands, is that the journey is very targeted, and they're very clear about what they want in quantitative terms, sometimes less clear about what they want in qualitative terms, because, I think anyone that has been working in the luxury industry for a long time and has been part of also creating desirable products, not that I am creative, but I understand the creative process very well. And I believe that if you don't have product desirability and the right product assortment in place, you're unlikely to take business. So it is the other side of the coin. And, but it is an interesting phase when brands go through transitions, different ownerships. But we sometimes also advise in selling companies, mostly, sometimes also acquiring them. But, typically what you're looking for is also the long term. For example, Chanel, Hermes, the large independent brands, that success was not built in 5 years, right? So that's sometimes the examples that we bring up with certain private equity firms, because you can't create legacy, monsters, let's put it that way, every fifth year. It's impossible, right? It takes time. So you probably have less of a long-term vision if you're a private equity-owned firm. There are exceptions because there are actually private equity firms that operate as though they're long-term owners. And I think that's really where you can convey talent and long-term trajectory in terms of performance.
Do you have, just to stay on the topic of how you advise these brands, like you mentioned specifically on the private equity cases, and the transformation of ownership and this transition journey, sorry. And can you also tell us how your advisory practice, what are the general, the most common cases where the clients, the fashion house, they come to you and they want to expand, they're facing some challenges going to Asia. What are these usual cases and how does your firm help them?
Sometimes certain brands that are new-ish, let's say maybe 5 or 10 years, they will be upfront about what they understand and what they don't understand. And I always believe that intelligent people will say, this is what I know about and this is what I know less about. And, that's when you bring in, let's say, expertise. And what we do, I mean, we have people that are Chinese speakers. We have people that are Japanese speakers. We have others that we call in for Korea. So we pretty much cover, first of all, from a language perspective, most of the markets, but also we have, in certain cases, boots on the ground. That helps, especially when people have different qualifications and that understand, let's say, inherently certain cultures. So I think people are quite comfortable coming with us with mandates that are global, because I think today's market, it's difficult to have a brand or a business that is not versatile enough to appeal to different markets. I think most people that build brands today, and when I say today, I mean recent brands, not the legacy brands, they have done so with smart scope and philosophy of understanding what they want to achieve, who they are, what their audience is, and then take advice when you go into, to kind of go into certain markets with efficient go-to-market strategies. Sometimes you don't have all the experts in-house, but we also see another phenomenon. I don't know how big it is yet in Asia, but I know some people that certainly work with that, like fractional C-suite, right? Because it can answer a lot of people's questions. I've always sort of broadly said it's better to have access to a high-level individual one day a week versus having a less efficient somebody there 100% of the time. So that's a way also of hatching your budgets in a different way. We sometimes are asked to recommend fractional profiles as well. And there are more and more people that want to work differently today. And I actually think it's richness too, that you are not only seeing one brand 15 times a day, as in we see a lot of different business models. We see a lot of different practices. And I think actually that's part of the reason that we can be efficient, because we can come fast and assess and diagnose and analyze a given situation, come up with concrete solution-based roadmaps. And again, that can be, what some people do. Others will ask us to have somebody in a fractional position over the long term because they want to have a lifeline or that kind of advice, but on a retained basis, right? So, I suspect, as I said earlier, that fractional perhaps leaderships and more multicultural compositions and more multicultural leadership teams is what a given business, brand, organization needs in order to stay, ahead of the curve.
Do you have specific challenges, concrete challenges that the clients come to you with and ask for your help when it comes, again, connected to European brands being in Asia or China, if you have any?
Sometimes it can be that certain brands, even of a let's say sizable volume, they don't always understand why they are not taking the same market share or performance as their competitors are. You know, it's a rational question, which I totally understand. But then we go into our toolbox and our fine-tuning kind of mind space, and we kind of try to look at what they have done that was efficient, what they might have done that was less efficient. And sometimes it turns out that they have not been able to build the right engagement processes. In other words, they have not reached their audience, because you'll agree with me that in China specifically, there is not one client typology today. There are so many that we have names for across demographics and across profiles. So the whole client profiling aspect is sometimes what weakens a brand's performance. And, you know, the whole phenomena of calls, the influencers and key opinion leaders and so on in China, you can't use the same actor, singer for across all the brands, which, you know, we've seen a tendency. Certain groups have been, let's say, targeting more or less the same people. There have been some scandals there. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just trying to express how complex it is, but you have to go into the deep end of dissecting why a given brand has not had much performance and how it is invariably affecting business, right? I mean, it's fine-tuning the tools you have and the execution levels as well.
I can only agree with what you mentioned, especially around China, and maybe to a little bit close on this conversation. How do you say would be your activity in your advisory practice around China, and do you wish to work more with brands to China, or are you already doing in a sizable? Do you already have a sizable activity, and how do you see also the phenomenon of working with Chinese brands in Europe?
It would be truthful to say, Kevin, that we have mainly worked on behalf of, let's say, international brands into China versus the opposite. I mean, I've had some interaction with Chinese companies, and we are keen to continue that dialogue because, as I said earlier, we are convinced that there'll be a lot more talent and brands in the premium luxury coming from the Asian continent into the global markets. We'd love to do more. We'd love to speak to people. But I guess what sets us apart, truthfully, is the fact that we can go full circle. In other words, we can take things from strategic vision, combine it with a good dose of creative branding to understand the design language and the halo of a brand, to translate that into actionable consumer-facing solutions. We can also look at the longer term of future-proofing systems and kind of support in a more technical manner. But do I speak Chinese? No, the answer is no. We have people that do. Some of these groups are already present in certain global markets, but I think it's maybe in China that you need to get under the skin almost of the Chinese ownerships, in some cases the boards, because and that's I'm turning the question to you that you asked me before. Are Chinese owned brands willing to, or receptive rather than willing to, are they receptive to that? I don't know, but I think that's maybe where the big changes and magic may take place.
Anne-Lynn, that was great to have you today. Appreciate the conversation. I'm sure the listeners will do too. Thank you, Anne-Lynn.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Leaders in Motion. And if you want to go further, join the Leaders in Motion Academy, our executive program. The first step is simple. Subscribe to our newsletter in the show notes, and you'll get access to our exclusive insights and all the details about the Academy. This podcast is produced by Melanie Hong, who helps leaders and organizations create strategic podcasts. I'm Kevin Hong, and see you next time.